constructively to try and improve it even further. Kia ora, Mr Speaker.
Jami-Lee Ross.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Speaker, it's a shame that such a significant event like the arena grounding has been turned into such a political football here tonight. Mr Speaker, I think it's worthwhile acknowledging the people who spent hours and hours and hours on the beaches cleaning up the oil. I think it's worthwhile acknowledging the people who have risked their lives to try and dismantle and take containers off that grounded vessel, and the people who acted immediately, who responded, the first responders to be on the scene so quickly, to be doing the work to try and sort out that situation as quickly as possible. They should also be acknowledged. So rather than turning it into a political football, I think we should firstly be acknowledging the excellent work that's been done on trying to recover from that. Mr Speaker, if you were to listen to the speeches of the opposition members, you'd almost come to believe that and understand from their speeches that the government drove the boat onto the reef. In fact, no. This government has actually acted pretty quickly and very swiftly to deal with the consequences of that disaster. And I think Stephen Joyce and other ministers who are involved should actually be congratulated for it too. Mr Speaker, this legislation is about making changes to the oversight of port, harbour and navigation safety, and it's also about making changes to implement our international maritime conventions and protocols. We've been criticised tonight, although there seems to be cross-party support for the legislation. There's been a lot of criticism about the time that's been taken for these protocols to see legislative change. I think it's worthwhile looking at the dates, however, Mr Speaker, that these protocols were actually signed, because we're getting criticised that this government has done very little to implement the protocols, but in fact many of these protocols were signed a long time ago, and actually before the Labour government came into office last in 1999. If they want to criticise National for not implementing these protocols fast enough, they should really be looking at their own record whereby they failed to implement these protocols as well. So, Mr Speaker, the protocol of limitation of liability for maritime claims, that was signed in 1996. The International Convention on Civil Liability for bunker oil damage came into effect in 2001. So, Mr Speaker, if one wants to criticise the time that's been taken, one should look in the mirror when they're making comments like that. Mr Speaker, the fact of the matter is there was a disaster in New Zealand that has led to this greater impetus for these protocols to be enacted through legislation. We should be saying good on the government for doing that. Well done, government, for putting in place the legislation to bring these protocols into effect, and let's all work together on ensuring that the legislation we have in front of us is as well written as it can be and enacts the protocols in the way that we want it to. Mr Speaker, I also want to touch briefly on the question of the protocol that is going to be implemented through legislation which sets the maximum alcohol limit of 0.05 grams of alcohol. Now, yes, I've heard the criticism from opposition parties on this as well, but I think there's actually a very logical explanation for it. If one actually reads the bill, we'll see that New Zealand is a party to the International Convention on Standards of Training, Certification and Watchkeeping for Seafarers. That's actually a 1978 protocol, which I think there were several Labour governments that were in place post-1978, if we're to be consistent with our points since. Mr Speaker, yes, that protocol does recommend that alcohol limit of 0.5 be implemented, but the logical reason for why that is different from what we have in place for road users is because it's around risk mitigation. And you have to say that if there's going to be somebody behind a multi-million-dollar vessel carrying hundreds of millions of tonnes of oil, with the risk that it could cause millions of dollars worth of damage to New Zealand's sea, to New Zealand's beaches, then yes, you would have a greater risk mitigation strategy in place, and that's what this is around. If we're to take the logical conclusion that they're arguing that any laws around what happens in sea should also be reflected in what happens on land with vehicles, then I'd like to bring up the case of aviation, because I come from an aviation background, and in aviation, the aviation rules, the regulations, actually don't allow pilots to have any alcohol in their blood when they're flying. Mr. Speaker, no crew member in aviation can have any alcohol in their blood. So if they're to say that, for people at sea, if there's a 0.05 limit for people at sea, that should also apply on land with vehicles, then I'm guessing they're also arguing that if there's a zero limit for aviation, there should also be a zero limit for vehicles. I look forward to them coming out and telling the New Zealand public that there's a zero limit for alcohol for vehicles, because I don't think that would go down very well. Mr. Speaker, let's all get behind this legislation, realise it's implementing some important international protocols that arguably should have been put in place some years ago. But if we're going to be critical about the timing, we should all look in the mirror, because it's a case of several governments having not implemented those protocols. But we're taking the steps now to do that, and that should be congratulated.
Brendan Horan.
Mr. Speaker, I rise on behalf of New Zealand First to speak